this audible? I won't be using a mic.
Talking amongst yourself, please keep it to the lowest possible.
I know. I won't be using a mic. I'll be loud enough, trust me. Quick shout out to Vansh for carrying me again and Samriddhi. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. What's our model? I think firstly this is a code that's likely to be set up just like the ICC or just like the ICJ or other UN bodies. I think this is a unique space in which a lot of smaller countries are likely to have some amount of power. This is also because a lot of these countries are not alone. They often have blocks which they're a part of, such as ASEAN and stuff like that. Secondly, we believe that interest of all blocks is likely to be represented since it's an international body that is likely to consider the opinion or like the background of a lot of these countries. The third thing to just note is that it's likely to have judges from all of these countries or from the most vast number of countries. This is probably because you want to accommodate a lot of the different backgrounds that these people come from. Secondly, we believe that this is likely to be made on consensus, given the fact that it's going to have moderate laws, since you want to have a lot of mass opt-in as opposed to the opt-in of just like a very few number of countries, which is why it's going to have moderate laws so that a larger number of people can start opting in, and you're going to be accessible to a lot of these countries since it's an international body such as the UN and stuff like that, which is why it's likely to be accessible. Clarification?
What is moderate? You're forgiving debt.
I don't think this is a debate about like extreme laws. I think moderate laws here uniquely mean that you're going to have laws that don't specifically cater to US or China. You're likely to have laws that cater to a larger group of people, which is why it's going to have moderate laws. Secondly, why is this going to have a lot of opt-in? I think the first thing to just note is that when you opt into this, it's going to have mutually assured destruction, which no country ever wants. Which is to say that it's important that like most countries understand that debt is incredibly important to get rid of, because it often hampers a lot of the growth or economic growth that a country can have. But secondly, smaller countries uniquely opt in because bilateral treaties are far worse, wherein big bullies such as USA and China can uniquely make you bow down to their will, which is why a lot of smaller countries are likely to opt in. Thirdly, we believe that political regimes also are likely to buy in, since these are newer political regimes that want to escape the imaging of the last political regime, which has had a lot of debt, which is why you want to delegitimize the last regime by making sure that you opt into this and buy into this process. Why will the losers also opt in, such as USA and China? I think firstly, when you do not opt into this ICJ like code, you're probably going to have a lot of like negative backlash with regards to people not wanting to take any sort of debt from you, which is to say that if USA pulls out of this code, most countries are not likely to approach a country like USA because it's seen as an actor that does not want to give out a lot of loans to the smaller countries, which is why countries like USA are also likely to opt in. Thirdly, when do countries opt in? I think the first thing to note here that this is the last resort, because at the point of time you opt in, you probably deter or cut out a lot of the relations that you have previously had. Which is to say that if India and China, or Sri Lanka and China were to be in a relation, were to be in an economic relation here, if Sri Lanka ends up filing this conflict, it's far more likely that China pulls out of Sri Lanka altogether. This is crucially bad because now Sri Lanka is unlikely to get any sort of political support or economic support from a country like China, wherein businesses also stop flowing down to countries like Sri Lanka. I think secondly, we think that this is a long drawn out process, which is why you probably need a shit ton of money to be able to go to court and have the lawyers required to be able to have some sort of strength in this court. Even evidence collection as a whole takes a lot of time to get done with, which is why this is probably going to be a last regime for most countries. You don't just have a shit ton of countries just coming in all together. Okay. Why is debt incredibly bad, and why this is the only mechanism through which you can get rid of debt? I think the first thing to just note is that there is no international body out there that can help you resolve a lot of debt, and often this debt keeps compounding because the way in which this debt is often given to a lot of countries is through massive interest rates. You probably levy massive interest rates on a country like Sri Lanka as China to make sure that you can have a lot of money coming in from a country like Sri Lanka. But secondly, this is crucially harmful because a lot of public spending is dependent on this debt. Which is to say, when your government treasuries are just low on money, it's unlikely that a country like Sri Lanka is going to be able to have a lot of public spending on infrastructure such as roads, on like things like banks and stuff like that. Which is why the country's development altogether starts slowing down. Secondly, we believe that this debt being so large in nature, it's incredibly hard for it to be paid at once. Which is why this debt is often paid in interest, wherein you have to keep paying for it. Notice this is bad because often this debt compounds over time, which is why the money required to be given also keeps increasing, which means that you have to keep paying over a 10-year period, and you have to keep paying these countries back, which is incredibly bad. Thirdly, we think that debt in and of itself gives incredibly bad investor signaling, because now this country seems like a country that just can't give out a lot of loans to a lot of investors. But fourthly, it has incredibly bad political optics, because at the point of time you have such large debt, there's a lot of pressure from other individuals or other political parties within your country to try and get rid of this debt, except because of the fact that this debt is so large, and this debt was even levied because of the previous political regime. It's incredibly hard to get rid of this debt, because often it's due to structural reasons such as corruption and stuff like that, which is why it's very hard for a lot of these countries to pay off debt.
You miss your actual burden. Why will countries like America opt in? You can't just...
I've already clarified that. Respond to our case meaningfully. Firstly, why is prosecution likely to work on our side of the house, and why will debt be gotten rid of meaningfully? I think there are three claims on this. Firstly, this being an incredibly open body like the ICJ, there's going to be a shit ton of media coverage surrounding the ways in which these cases are also evolving. Which is to say that not only will there be high public scrutiny with regards to a country like USA, if in case it tries to be the big bully within a court like this, but secondly, you can't be an openly bad actor, because ICJ also controls the way in which USA acts, which is why ICJ, or whatever this international body is going to be a good mediator. Thirdly, we believe that this is incredibly bad for larger countries, because now the smaller countries can appear to be the martyr, wherein they can get a lot of public legitimacy in terms of the ways in which they claim that USA has locked them out, which is why you have a lot of smaller countries banding their own resources together and making sure that you can file a meaningful case against a country like USA, which means that the way in which this is now going to be conducted is going to be incredibly good for a lot of small countries. Secondly, we believe that international judges are likely to act meaningfully on our side of the house, because firstly, the way in which you have even gotten to this position was after you have gotten a lot of legitimacy. So you're probably a judge that has worked for years upon years, but secondly, you probably have to have a lot of cases and a lot of experience under your belt to be able to reach this position, which is why you're going to be brave in nature. But thirdly, since this is a pool of judges that is incredibly diverse in nature, you probably have a lot of regional biases also being catered to, in which you can explain the court cases. What are the impacts of this? I think firstly, in the absence of debt, you have an incredibly good positive investor signaling, where more countries are likely to opt into your country because it seems far more stable in nature. But secondly, you probably have a lot of public spending increase, which is why growth increases.
I thank the Prime Minister for the very fine speech. I now invite the Leader of Opposition to open the case. Here.
Yeah, I'll get to that. Sure. Before I begin, thank you to Mehal for carrying me and basically teaching me debating as well. So, to her, obviously. But yeah, with that, so I'll take tabs at 357, standard tabs, 357. Cool. Starting my speech, and for POIs, guys, and preferably one from you guys. You can, I verbally ask one in case, because I can't see you raising your hand.
Yeah. All right.
Can
you be a little louder?
Yeah, I will be louder when I'm speaking.
You can use the mic.
No, it's better this way. Alright, cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, during case prep, all I looked for was a model from government so I could come and rebut it, right? We don't get that. We were expecting a model in terms of, firstly, what does this debt look like so that this court can then decide actually if it's viably to like forgive it or not, right? They never tell you. The idea is the court will be moderate. What does moderate look like? It's up for debate, which means that if PM doesn't tell you that, I don't think DPM can come and give a model now because it's unfair. You have to do that from the very first speech, right? But now moving on. Another problem with the model, quote unquote, which they give out, it's that firstly, they try to sell you on opt-in that large corporate, like large developed countries would opt into this because they fear backlash. Understand that by their framing, they have a lot of pull in terms of how they control this, like even UN bodies, existing world bodies. When that happens, they probably don't give a shit about backlash from these developing countries because they probably have like other invested sentiments within that particular nation to begin with. But more importantly, they don't have enough of an incentive to opt into this because backlash from developing countries probably doesn't affect them as much because they have an established hegemony in like a lot of UN bodies and just global discourse because they have more funding behind them, right? Which means that if these countries are the debtor, if these countries are creditor countries who are like giving out these loans, you probably can't strong arm them into joining this corporation in the first place. Which means that opt-in doesn't happen. Which means that I can't understand why this court would exist in the first place. But let's now, from this point on, make this debate if they're given a valid model to begin with, right? What does this debate become then, right? Panel, firstly, understand how do a lot of this like, debt financing work in a lot of developing countries. Understand a lot of developing countries, the basic, like the leading parties, like basic incentives are fucked because they probably still want to look at electoral benefits which they can get by giving out like small term like benefits to their people. What does that look like? Like governments like distributing free liquor to people for elections. Governments give like free electricity, free water, just like basic amenities to people, but they give it for free. Understand that that's bad because when you do that for these people, you probably don't like take into account the long-term ramification of it, which means that these investments won't be sustainable because they don't have an active source of revenue to like keep on counteracting because everything this does come with a cost to begin with, which means that you basically are advising these developing countries to show not a fucking ounce of like financial discipline because they know that they can get a clean slate to begin with. Understand why this is bad and understand why accountability lies solely on like oversight on this debate, right? Understand. Like understandably, even given the caps like clarification, this only happens when the government changes. But still understand, right? For example, if like BJP fucks up massively and develops like a shit ton of debt, once they like voted out, right? Congress can probably like get that like I don't know, like forgiven. Which means that the accountability which would originally fall on BJP is now limited because now if that didn't happen, right? Which means that BJP gets like held more accountable in the long term because the Congress can constantly tell them and the government and country is fucked because of it. Which means that the people of India probably care about it a lot more, right? Which means that in both paradigms, what is constant is that this government has to get unelected first. But once that does happen, understand what is the long-term accountability metric, right? And that's greater in our paradigm because now you're actually able to see the effects of that, right? If that debt is instantly forgiven the moment BJP loses, I as an Indian person, I'm never able to see the larger ramifications and problems of that debt in the first place. Which means that in my eyes, all I see is that probably Congress had different motives for what they want to do with the money and they didn't want and wanted to have a clean slate. Which means that I never understand the problem with this debate. Which means that I never understand that why should I have held this government accountable in the first place because they were forgiven, and that becomes a long-term metric, right? But secondly, panel, on the point of like precedence, understand, and this is extremely important given their picturization. If these developed countries are already disincentivized to give money to these developing nations and they charge high interest rates, understand why that's likely to get much worse in their side. And later, understand it's very important that when these large-scale like developed countries already like have certain sentiments within these nations. So like if they already consider developing nations as unreliable debtors, they're probably going to do that even more now, right? Even if a judgment does not go against them, even if this court is the most moderate court ever to exist, even then, panel, there exists a threat. In this threat is that even if like it's actually it's actually genuine to give them that loan back, it is also important to make sure that as a developed country, my loan will be forgiven, which means that I never get that money back. So regardless of whatever actually happens or not, I'm going to be more wary of giving the loan in the first place. I'm probably going to charge a much higher interest rate. So if the framing in this debate is that developing countries need this debt to survive, that becomes worse on their side because now as a developed country, I have even less of an incentive to give them this debt in the first place, but also I'm going to charge a much higher interest rate in the first place. Therefore, even that metric, even by their own metric, they're fucked because now this interest rate is even higher, right? And this is when this court is the best court in the world. But thirdly, they tell you that this court will look like other UN bodies too. They tell you that this court will look like how other bodies are made. Understand why that's bad is because within these bodies themselves, there exists a certain amount of hegemony which is controlled by developed countries in the first place. Which means that this also now extends when you're like forgiving this debt, this hegemony is likely to exist. Just because like blocks of developing countries exist, that does not mean that they'll get their voice heard, right? Because we've seen this happen in the past. Like several historical examples. There's a reason why like government of India was probably like not allowed to give concessions to farmers, but like USA was by WTO. Understand this difference exists, and that's because of the amount of pull that USA had within the WTO. When all of these things exist, and by their contractualization is the same which happens to this code, these things will again exist. Which means that when they do, developed countries will obviously get able to get their way a lot more even now in this paradigm. Before that, a POI.
Do you think how many countries are going to actively start opting into this? Is it
Yeah,
too
yeah.
many countries?
Understand, panel, that this is like their burden to prove how many countries opt into this in the first place, right? But till the time they prove that, I'm going to like take this debate based off of that, right? I tell you why this opt-in is not likely, but even if it is, then also they suck, right? That's essentially what we're telling you. But more important, right, as I was telling you, when these like have already established hegemony, developed countries are probably more likely to get their benefits catered to more as opposed to developing countries. So if that's a major stakeholder for opening government, I think they're out of this debate even then, because even now they're fucked. But thirdly, panel, understand, right? What is the alternative to this? If this doesn't happen, what do we look at then? Understand that when you're looking at other bodies, right, which obviously like work towards like maintaining foreign investment for these countries, what does that look like? It looks like because they have different incentives. So for example, if like IMF and WTO like wanted India to change its policies in 1991, they asked him to like liberalize the economy. They asked him to like focus on globalization. They asked him to like open the doors. They remove tariffs. When all of those things happen, understand they did it because that was probably like a better long-term investment. However, if government at that time was simply able to like shrug off any fucking responsibility by saying that it was a previous government, they're more likely to follow the same path again, which means that you're now stuck in a vicious cycle where you're doing the same shit again and again because you're never forced to learn from your mistakes, because you never get to the point of desperation where you actively have to listen to these organizations. But now that changes, right? We see that in India. It's like the biggest fucking example there is, that you listen to like long-term sustainable impacts which you bring out and which they tell you to do so, which means that Indian economy is much better now than it was like 30 years ago, and it's primarily because of these policies, because we were forced to listen to them. However, at that point of time, if like policy existed that just because you get de-elected you get all your all your debt written off, it's unfair because now I will never learn and I'll do the same mistake 10 years down the line, which means I'm caught in a vicious cycle. And if I'm never able to tap out of it, I think panel, their entire case is then debunked because they tell you that their model doesn't exist. But even if it does, it's a shitty model because then you don't necessarily have a case for it. Because developing countries, if that's the only stakeholder, they're not benefiting in this debate regardless. But when you look at other countries as well, opt-in is unlikely. Even if it happens, even then they'll raise interest rate. They won't give them debt because other factors also have to be taken into account, right? It does not take place into isolation. You can't look at it from one perspective. You have to look at it from the perspective of the developed countries as well. And we'll take both perspectives into account. I think OG is out of this debate.
I thank the leader of opposition for the very fine speech. I now invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case. Here.
Vansh, can you just wait for a minute? I'll just check.
Should I start Siddharth? ये बंद हो जाएगा यार.
हाँ, Vansh, whenever you're ready.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Before I start, standard 3D2 team in the final. That's like a lot of, more than half of the debaters in the final being DT, which is like quite a big thing. And like, not a big thing because last year same tha, so. Shut up. Idhar aana, don't leave it. Starting my speech in 3, 2. Also ask 2 POIs. I'll take. No tabs. And don't like give POIs. Don't hide your case just because you fear eating it up. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to talk about buy-in after that political incentives, and then economic development on buy-in. The claim coming from opening opposition is the fact that you cannot hold previous dispensations accountable. The problem is, one, it is super uncomparative because if these dispensations have already been elected out of power, then the electoral ballot has already reflected a degree of accountability. But the second thing I would note is the fact that this will never become a political issue on their side of the house, because at best it is economic negotiation between different countries, except it never becomes a visibilized political issue. So insofar as you don't have that visibility of why a harm was created in the previous dispensation, opt case is a non-starter because it is uncomparative to the same problems that they identify. That means that the only way in which you can have political accountability is when the previous dispensations are dragged to court in a way in which you blame the previous dispensation for all of the economic harms that have been created. That means that the claim on accountability is uncomparative. But three reasons why the buy-in continues to happen, which is the PI that CEO has. The first thing about losers and countries such as the USA is that they are also in massive sovereign debt. The first claim we made is that all countries who are in debt have a natural incentive to join this specific court because they realize that they would require the court at some point for their debt to be written off. That's the reason why all countries will do it. Even if US loses a prosecution, we think that they have incentives to stay as opposed to not leave because US can get massive benefits out of this later, which is the claim that we made. The second thing to note is the fact that you want to be viewed as the political regime who solved the crisis, which means that in a world in which it never becomes a politicized issue, successive political regimes will never benefit out of this as an electoral issue. Which means that as the BJP right now, I would want to actively opt into this court, and that opt-in would never lead to, and insofar as that opt-in never happens on their side, the Congress can never be held liable. So there's a political incentive that you have. The final thing I would note is the fact that presumably countries like US and China already exist in power blocks, which means that if they are doing it and you see them doing it, you as a smaller country also have some diplomatic pressure to buy in. That means that you're going to have significant buy-in. How will prosecutions work and why they're going to be super effective? The first thing I would note is that there is going to be massive coverage of media, say in the liberal media. So for example, you have channels like Al Jazeera, or you have, say, the Economist, which is talking about this specific issue. We think the issue becomes far more visibilized. The easy impact of this is the fact that you can get mass mobilization on your specific issue as a political party, and you can go ahead and mobilize all of the fringe elements so that you can oppose this common oppressor, which means that even if BJP is the current government right now, we are fine with defending the fact that BJP would be a far better government than the Congress, because the Congress was a large welfare spender and never really did things like financial planning. Insofar as that is the case, we think that blaming any dispensation cannot be the opt case because it is reliant upon a specific contextual reality. Our claim is an overarching claim of the fact that the current dispensation is reflective of people's preferences, and as long as that is the case, they should have the power to go ahead and hold the previous government liable, which never happens on their side of the house. So as long as this issue is far more media coverage, you're going to get international support, you're also going to get internal support. Second, judges are not bad. The claim coming from their side could be that these are hegemons, except we already explained the moderation mechanism that existed when the UN was passed and when the UN came about post World War II. The way in which this empirically worked is the fact that when US came to the UN, there was natural incentive for other countries also to join the UN, just so that US cannot run havoc in determining all policy in the world. Insofar as that is the case, we think that you are also going to then have judges from all of these countries so that there can be a moderating effect. The other thing we say is the fact that judges don't necessarily need to represent their country. They can often be independent individuals because one, they don't have any threat of the political government pulling them out at any point, because once you have reached the ICJ, the Indian government cannot withdraw you back if you're an Indian judge because they have independent jurisdiction. But more importantly, we think that courts in and of themselves, these people are really educated, which means that they would likely want to make good decisions so that they can remain within the ICJ. What are the two massive impacts of this in the round? The first is the fact that the political incentives of regimes become far better on our side of the house. There are three ways to make this out. The first is that as long as you want to be viewed as a regime which solved the crisis, you can gain lots of national legitimacy, and even people who are on the fence are more likely to buy into you, and they buy into the kind of policies that you are making because there's a positive virtue signal for an electorate. The second thing to note is the fact that this is the way in which right-wing states can actively blame big left welfare states, to the extent that these left welfare states never really did things the economic restructuring or planning economic growth in the long term, which is what we get far more on our side of the house, as Himan uniquely explains. So this is a unique way in which the right wing can become powerful, which is the case we are willing to defend economically, because the kind of investor benefits that we get on our side of the house are far better. The final thing I would note on electoral incentives is the fact that presumably, as long as this becomes an economic issue and like a visibilization issue, we think that this becomes a far more public thing, which just means that the public legitimacy that you also get via the virtue of this is far better, which means that the political incentives become better. The clear impact of this is stability. I would note that these are often countries who are ridden with a lot of debt, and these are often countries who are desperate to get out of this problem. So insofar as these are desperate, presumably there are lots of issues that already exist within the country. So the prior requirement for these countries to stabilize is when people politically mobilize. That uniquely happens on our side of the house. Why does this matter? First, this is the largest impact in the round because it's independent of all of the economic debate that Offbench is going to have. But more importantly, we think that this has a certain impact that benefits political leaders, independent of whether they are successful in prosecutions or not, because the very fact that this becomes public is really good for political incentives. Closing opposition.
So these are very desperate states, but they can pressure the US into forgiving their debts. The fuck?
They cannot pressure the US definitively on their side of the house. On our side, you have the leverage that as long as this becomes a public issue, China will be positively signaled by the fact that this small country is willing to go to the court, which means that it's a signal to the alternate bloc that we are here for you, and hence the alternate bloc will want to pull the country away, which means that the smaller country gets far more leverage on our side, they don't get it on theirs. Economic incentives. The first thing I would note on what the nature of this debt is that it is often sovereign debt that countries borrow from each other because they need to invest in public spending. So closing government can run a sliding extension on what debt is. I don't think it matters. The final thing is that you have an expectation to repay it independent of the nature of the debt, and that is the expectation you need to escape for the country to go and unlock the most amount of benefits. What are these economic benefits? Three things. Number one, there's massive investor confidence that happens on our side of the house. The reason is that the very fact that your country is in debt necessarily means that corporations have a disincentive to opt into your country because you don't get a huge degree of government benefits. The second is that domestic producers can't get loans because banks are often unwilling to provide too many loans in instances where the debt has been, when there's massive sovereign debt, because you want to reduce the amount of money people are spending because governments don't want to reinvest money back. The final thing is that you will get far more financial regulation on our side of the house at the point at which you get rid of debt, because countries which are in debt are also the countries where the economic will is the least. So at the point at which you are able to offset it, you can build an impetus for more financial regulations, which means that the economy can become sustainable in the long term. This matters for the simple reason that money is really important for these countries, and they're stuck in the vicious cycle of repaying debt back on their side with absolutely no alternatives. Proud to win.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for the very fine speech. I now invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the case here.
Hi, am I clearly audible? Cool. Yeah, shout out to GGS Depsoc and Gunveer, Kshitiz, and all my juniors. Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. We think opt-in by developed states is unlikely. One, there is no partisan support for US to go ahead and increase their debt ceiling even more, which is to say deficit financing, engaging with other nations is something that is already achieving large-scale backlash. But second, know that a lot of developed countries already have capitalist lobbies pushing for them, which is to say you have banks, you have investment banks, hedge funds, which have invested in these countries. These banks need their money back because this is a formalized system in which it exists. We think this case exists in an overwhelming number of majority. Insofar, one, you only have formalized systems, largely have formalized systems of debt and borrowing in most developed countries where you can take money from the public, put them in bonds, and then go ahead and sell them, or go ahead and let developing countries borrow them, which is to say a large flow of debt is coming from developed nations to developing nations, and therefore this hegemony is something that Gunveer already talks to you about, which is to say a lot of countries which are debt ridden because of the sort of spending that they do, and this is something that OG never goes ahead and concedes on, which is to say a lot of welfare spending can also be disguised policies under the garb of populist spending, which is to say, instead of like actually building infrastructure, etc., you go ahead and provide free electricity, like free water, etc., which is to say, this is not specifically in the like welfare of the nation, because you're going ahead and doing it in order to get like better electoral incentives to like go ahead and like deceive people into like voting for you, which is to say, a lot of this welfare spending is not only poorly classified as in the interest of the people, but also gets like no sort of like long-term accountability. Why is this true? One, we think you already have like different governments coming up in developing countries, because a lot of them are already plagued with like political instability, which is to say, you have like coalitions coming in power, you have governments failing, you have accusations of like electoral misconduct, but even after that, you have people like swaying here to there, which is to say, a smart ideological stance never really exists, and there is no differentiation largely that exists, which is to say, most developing countries have an active, most parties in developing countries have an active incentive to go ahead and like spend like on free liquor, have like spending on like free water, etc., so that it creates an easy opt-in. We think on their side of the house, you actually never go ahead and have austerity measures in place, because people don't want austerity measures. Austerity measures are bad for people. When the Greek financial crisis happened, people did not want their pension funds to reduce. They wanted them to be inflated. People have no incentive to not want free goods from the government. They'd rather go ahead and free ride on all these goods that are available, which is to say, any sort of public backlash or public accountability is something that doesn't exist on their side. But note, right, they never really engage on why this is positive investor signaling, insofar you're going to like an international body and telling them, hey, we're debt ridden, we don't have any sort of like mechanisms to pay back this debt. Why is this true? One, you're literally going ahead and signaling that your credit rating falls, but you're also signaling that your governments are not responsible enough to manage this debt and create a restructuring process, which is whatever Vansh tells you never really happens, because you never really are able to go ahead and demand any sort of accountability. You just ask them to run free. There is not a bailout with long-term accountability structures. This literally means that when IMF bails you out, it asks you to open your economy. It asks you to no longer be a prey to like your domestic businesses lobbying you up. It means that you go ahead and like invite trade, etc. This all is pretty good, because it helps you like restructure your debt financing in the long term. This also happens irrespective of whichever party is in like play, because you have a strict obligation to go ahead and repay your debt at all points of time. But before that, CG.
These are not going to be countries like India, that BJP and Congress. These are going to be countries that were under autocratic control like Venezuela and South Sudan that don't have a capacity to send this back. Build on the right comparators.
I think one, you need to know that there is not likely to be a public support for suddenly like this debt to like go away. But even then, this is just bad in the long term, insofar you don't have any sort of you don't have any incentives as like a new coming government to suddenly open up your gates for like international flow, etc. Why is this true? One, because note, in a lot of these autocratic governments, you had like local domestic businesses that used to strongly who want to enjoy that sort of monopoly within your economies, which is to say, prior to liberalization, India literally had conglomerates of like big size, which were not okay with foreign competition coming in. This is bad, right? Because your like economy is like incredibly inefficient. But secondly, you're never able to become an export-oriented country. We think at large, even if their comparative is that these are like poor countries that had like no opt-in, no opt-out, whatever. We think by virtue of IMF bailout, you can literally take away their debt, but like impose really harsh like accountability measures, and that is the comparative you had to defend at opening. Why do we think this is just better on our side? One, we think that then you're more likely to go ahead and you're more likely to create a long-term change in your domestic policies, which is to say you're likely to go ahead and like open up your economies to the extent that you become an export-oriented country, which is something that wouldn't have happened on a comparative, insofar you have no incentive, like your domestic like markets, etc., never lobby you to do that. But secondly, we think that your spending, etc., just becomes better, insofar you're not allowed to like give like subsidies to your farmers to the extent that it becomes really bad on like those grounds. We think then on their side, populist incentives still exist, because they're able to like easily shrug off accountability as it happened in the previous government. It's not likely to happen now, but I'm just unsure what is the certain impact on their side, insofar they're never able to prove why this country wouldn't relapse, and why then by this virtue you wouldn't be like you can't escape debt on their side. But secondly, note that this is just incredibly bad in terms of the way that your credit rating tanks, which means interest rates are incredibly high on the debt now that you will have to borrow. This means that you're literally giving a signaling to most investors that hey, we're an incredibly risky country to invest in. This becomes even more of an optical show on their side. Note on our side, IMF still has incentives to go ahead and push more developed countries like US, etc. to go ahead and engage with you in this manner. But secondly, note, right, when you go ahead and take the help of IMF and large bodies, you're also likely to get a lot of technology, which is to say you can get into trade deals. You have countries coming in and still helping you out, as opposed to on their side of the house where you don't necessarily understand where are these investors coming from. I think why we take it over government is this. One, we think accountability is something that can still be struck because populist incentives are loved by all people across the political spectrum, because it literally means in a bad economy you're able to get free water, you're able to get free supplies, etc. It literally means that the onus that you put on people is a lot less, and governments are just taking loans to go ahead and furnish these demands. But secondly, even if there's any sort of call out, it's just incredibly unlikely because most people just love these free goodies, etc. so much that they're never likely to hold governments accountable on your side. We have an external mechanism that allows that not only is your government is only bailed out if these impositions are in place, which is to say the most certain thing that opening opposition is able to prove to you is that there's a change in which this government functions, the way this debt will be financed, and the way your policies actually change. On their side of the house, these governments are so unstable, they can literally relapse into failure, they can relapse into taking more and more debts. With that, proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for their very fine speech. I now invite the member of GUF to start the case.
Let's go.
Is this audible? Clear? Cool. Pranjal going member. Just don't give any tabs before 7:15. Drum me down post 7:15. Yeah, sure. While people are settling, a couple of shout-outs. I think I have possibly the most important people in my life in this room. So 4 D2 teams in general. 2 D2 teams in Angad. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for doing whatever you've done in the last 4 years. Special shout out to Shashwat for deciding to team up with me very, very late into the announcement of the tournament, but I appreciate it. Satvik, happy birthday. And I have Gunraj, etc. Everyone sitting here, which are really important people. Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Go. Panel, I'm going to beat OG because OG never proves what these terms of debt forgiving are. Are you really forgiving debt? On what levels does it work? And we're going to go ahead and beat O because O never gives you a mechanism of how these countries get out of debt in the first place and what these countries actually look like. What are the things I'm going to do? Firstly, we're going to talk about what are these countries because OG never makes it clear. We don't think it's going to be countries like India who have mechanisms to go ahead and repay debt. We think it's going to be countries that are shifting from an authoritarian dictatorship into democracy to begin with. Which means when there is significant regime change within countries from really, really bad dictatorial or authoritarian regimes to democracies, is likely when this shift and this realization is likely going to happen. Which means this is the point, or these are the countries like South Sudan, like Venezuela, etc., who approach this court to begin with. We don't think it's going to be regular countries, which means all of O's ideas of, you're not going to hold BJP ever accountable actually exist. It's not going to be people like that. But more importantly, when you go ahead and throw out a dictator, you've already held them accountable for the kind of shit they do, which means you already have proceedings going against them within your own countries that hold them accountable for the economic decisions, etc., that they've made, which means repercussions exist on our side of the house as well. You still have internally the country going ahead and doing this stuff. But more importantly, what are the priorities for these countries? We think the way in which these debts are structured are completely very, very important. Because note crucially, the kind of debt we are asking this court to forgive is likely to be that is very, very bad for these countries. What does that mean? We don't think it is high interest rates. It's also the kind of collateral that you keep to be able to repay that debt is a collateral chosen by your debtor. It's not a choice that you make. The choice that has been made by previous people, etc., which means the general populace does not know what is the collateral and it's not chosen by the people. It's really, really bad because in case you go ahead and not pay this debt, what is likely to happen is those resources are being taken away, which are not even chosen by the people to begin with. O never deals with this frame. O never tells you why will it become better. Their only mechanism is IMF. I'm going to deal with why IMF is probably useless in this debate and why do they have no incentives? They can't just go ahead and simply say that, oh, incentives exist. What are these incentives? Did I ever tell you? More importantly, why is OG like out of this debate? Because OG says that countries they are going to opt in. They never tell you why would US go ahead and opt into something that makes them lose money. We're going to prove to you why interest lies within US because their money is logged into these countries that are probably never able to emerge out of it to begin with. How does that operate is something I'm going to deal with. But more importantly, like, what does this debt look like and how are you going to go ahead and make it not enforceable? We don't think it necessarily means that you waive off entire debts. We think there are layers to it. Insofar as there's a code, people are able to decide what kind of decision they want for this debt. What does that mean? It means you probably go ahead and restructure it. It probably means you go ahead and waive off some part of it. It probably means you waive completely, which means there are parts or layers to which, to degree to which you're able to go ahead and waive off it and restructure it. Why do we think this restructuring is an incentive for like bigger countries like US, China, etc. to pull in? Because not crucially, why are the alternatives bad and why is this possibly the best mechanism for like US, etc. Because not crucially that their money is locked in, which means the possibility that this money is ever going to be recovered by US is extremely less. Not crucially that US internally has a lot of like dialogue, etc., which means that you cannot go ahead and simply be waiving off debts by the US uniquely, which means that US uniquely or as a singular actor cannot go ahead and do this because there isn't enough support from within the country to do this, which means they need a larger organization to help with ensuring that this debt is eventually paid off and they get the money back. We think it happens with this quote, something that does not happen with IMF. Secondly, we think China also has the incentive because also you don't want like Chinese people to lose out money. Chinese people do not want China to lose out money, which is why they're not going to go ahead and forgive this debt. They probably want to go ahead and establish more control within this country, and we have proved to you how that even happens on our side of the house, and we're okay with the trade-off to begin with. Lastly then, how is this like restructuring going to happen, and what are the ways in which it's going to happen? We think the point at which you go ahead and restructure it, what is likely to happen is that you go ahead and give ability to country to decide what resources they want to hold as collateral against that debt. What you go ahead and do is introduce procedures in order to make sure, like, you set up offices, you set up certain like policy makers, etc. within that country to make sure that its debt or like financial position of this country is maintained in to begin with. We think even if it means that you have foreign interests within the country, we are okay with it because the comparative is worse off when this debt is never paid off and you lose out like crucial resources on the rest of the house. Now moving on to why IMF was not going to do it and why other alternative sources are probably like worse. We think IMF has no incentive. Firstly, because the point at which IMF goes in and does it for one country, the problem is you change interest rate and market supply for all other countries for debt. This is not something that IMF wants because they want to make money, which means that IMF has no interest to do it. It is also losing legitimacy in terms like it being like used by like US, etc., which means that its idea of going ahead and lending out or like waiving off loans is significantly less, which means it's likely to be countries who assimilate, who pool in their resources, who pool in not just monetary resources but also intellectual resources to make sure that they're able to get some control in the country, which means that they can go ahead and invest, they can go ahead and still get cheap labor within these countries and ensure that this country has economic like stability, which means that all of CEO's ideas also of how will you ever make sure this country is economically stable happens on our side of the house as well, something that is not possible on comparative. Sure.
Even if your ambiguous model works and USA gets some part of its money back, now why will they ever give money to South Sudan again? Because the mechanism exists so that they don't have to give them money, which means that if South Sudan needs this money, they'll never get it again because they fucked US over.
We think the conditions under which US gives money to South Sudan is extremely bad. We think they're going to go ahead and trap them again into multiple like picking and choosing resources that they want. We think this model gives them the agency to go ahead and choose the collateral that they want to keep. They're able to go ahead and keep that collateral and decide on which resources are important for them and not. And why do we think South Sudan itself cannot make this decision independently without the existence of this advisory body or this court to begin with? We think South Sudan has multiple other priorities. It's a new forming country. It has a new administration, it has new structures in place, which means the kind of information that they have to be able to establish and decide what resources do they not want is significantly less. We think in that place, having this external actor, having this external advisory board, that's not necessarily just completely forgiving debt, but also advising on like restructuring and things like that, because that's what the courts do. You have like dissertations, you have like proper like judgments coming out that say what a country should like is likely to do. You're able to go ahead and deal with all of ops problems. They have to deal with the comparative of how does this debt ever go away. Why are people who have no fault of like this money is not with them, right? It's not like they can go ahead and give this money. It's being spent by like problematic rulers and like luxury items and things like that. They have very little money left. How do you go ahead and ensure that these people are able to sustain, at least in our side of the house, people do not die? We think that's a net benefit that accrues, something that OP has to deal with. Therefore, both of the opening benches are out because they never like tell you the model and they never tell you the comparative. CEO has to deal with all of these humps. Very, very proud to propose.
I thank the member of GUP for the very fine speech. Now I invite the member of opposition to start their case. Here.
Hi, okay, I'll be the first person to use the mic. One Tuesday?
Yes.
Sorry, you're just normally so loud that I can't tell. It's a compliment. You're a powerful man. Okay. I will take a POI from OG because they took one from me. Thank you. They said they'll take two, but it's okay. Yeah. Okay. It's fine. I have a timer. You can like wave your hands at 7:15 if you want. Okay. The entire debate till now has been extremely narrow and myopic because it's focused on the countries that are applying to the court to get their debt cancelled. CEO will ask another question. What about the countries that want a fucking loan? And that's the CEO extension very quickly. If your loan can be cancelled the second you as a dictator get overthrown, you're not a very good person to give money to because then the money doesn't come back. The CEO case is that if OG is correct and buy-in occurs, and if CG is correct and this goes to countries that really deserve it, it doesn't matter because every other country that does deserve it gets no money in the future. That's our case. Many countries being devastated compared to a few countries getting benefits. First, why are we new from opening opposition? OO has 3 points. First, they're going to say these are irresponsible countries such as the BJP spending on liquor. But then they say that they would then get like irresponsible loans over and over again, like they would get it forgiven. The main question I have is how dumb is this judge panel? Like maybe the first time they're like, fine, we'll forgive your debt after you paid a bunch of liquor to people. What about the second time or the third time? What about the investors in the country? What about everyone else? It's just really bizarre and uncharitable. The second thing they say is you look dumb because you've just admitted to the world that you cannot pay back your debt. Well, why did you ask? Because you had no alternative. I don't think these countries are so stupid that they just go up to the court and go like, please announce I'm broke. They'll say it because they're fucking broke. So this has no impact. The third impact is no one will agree to the court. And then nothing happens. So they just don't have a goddamn case. The CEO case is very simple. Number one, who are these nations and why is it that when you stop taking their debts back, we stop paying their loans? Second, what is the impact this has into the future on precedent? Third, what are the alternatives that countries will use instead? First, who are the nations this affect? CG is correct. These are often dictatorships, authoritarian governments, which obviously you cannot say were your fault as a revolutionary government. You obviously can't say that I made those decisions because it was literally a dictatorship. That's the most easy argument that people would agree to. Everyone seems to be questioning how it would work. I think it's the most reasonable one that other countries would also agree to because it actually wasn't your fault. You just revolted against them. That means that they're unstable governments which are currently teetering on the edge, which are dictatorships, and now you have to decide if you want to give loans to them. They won't get loans. First, because MNCs fund a huge amount of multilateral loans. The IMF doesn't just get money from member countries, it gets money from places like Adidas and Nike. Because those companies benefit from stability in the region. They benefit from trade routes and a stable country which they can sell their market and money to. But also, it's an investment. They make their money back. Which means that if you look at the actual track record of the IMF, it's horrific. They've never had a loan not paid back. Perhaps they've restructured, perhaps they've destroyed the country, but no country has had their loan forgiven by the IMF because they get their money back. They make sure the country does the taxation required to make sure it gets back to them, which means that these are very worthwhile investments for those countries. Second of all, it's also true that you don't get investments on-site gov because you realize that you don't have any leverage anymore. As a company, you don't have any control over the economy because at the second this dictatorship gets overthrown, all of it can be revolted, which means it's not a long-term investment worth your time. America doesn't trust you because it's not going to be stable in the long term because there might be a revolution coming. Third of all, you also don't have unique control, so you don't face investments and trades for the future. Specifically, you don't put in companies to help them grow because those companies might get fucked over in the future when their odious debt is forgiven. Note, this is the case Gov wants. This is their best case. A dictatorship that spent irresponsibly getting their debt cancelled. This is what they have to stand by, and I proved that it means less loans. Impacts and weighing. First, if you are giving money to a dictatorship and you know that when it gets overthrown, your loan gets forgiven, you want the dictatorship to stay in power.
First of all, this is why often when you have a choice between a democracy that might be more unstable and dictatorship, most countries like the US and China work through institutions like the IMF, which are good. Why? Their incentives are often very, very different in the IR states. The Chinese and the US fight each other all the time. What they can agree on is stability because they all want to trade. What they can agree on is less refugees going towards their allies, less security threats, less terrorists, less things like their minerals being locked out of the economy, which they might use for development. When they agree on that, they want stability. At the point where you can't do that because that money won't come back to you, it's easier to just fund the fucking dictatorship that you're giving loans to because then it won't get overthrown. So the alternative likelihood is that you make dictators stronger. So the obvious comparison here is that a lot of times you see places like Indonesia where Suharto borrowed like $20-30 billion in loans, right? And $1 to $2 billion was spent on personal corruption. The problem is that at least that money went into the government, went to people that the US used to create democracy and stabilize the economy and then slowly develop it. And when Suharto was kicked out, they had a bunch of rules, which is the second point. Why are IMF's rules better? Because first, because of the incentives I gave you, they want to do things like reduce corruption. They want you to open up your economy, but they also want MNCs to come in. And because it's IMF, multiple MNCs want to come in for those resources. Multiple companies that compete and give you better deals. And it's negotiated through a central authority, so it's hard to scam these people because companies don't want someone else eating the oil before they do. So they get good money, good companies, good labor and employment and slow growth. I'm not saying that they become utopias, but Rwanda didn't become a stable economy out of nowhere. It got a huge amount of funding from the IMF. Neither did South Korea or Japan after post-World War II. They used that money to build up their economies because that's all they could have done. If the loan doesn't work out, then we're going to show the second part. What happens if you don't get the loan and dictatorships have no alternative? OG.
Or bench is uncomparative because most of their incentive analysis on politics and on economics is a condition of a post-conflict state and not a tipping point by the motion itself. So most of the problems are symmetric.
No, because you get your money back and you get your control even if the government changes, which is your main incentive. Like I said, you want stability, control, political influence. I mean, I know you didn't listen much, but at least that much. Okay, so second of all, what happens when dictatorships don't get loans? Well, they don't have money, but they still need to maintain control. The problem is, dictatorships occur in poor countries where people are poor and desperate. The solution isn't more poverty. So when there's less money, dictatorships get desperate. They start funding their military. They start making sure to crack down on every protest possible so that no one can attack them. They destroy the infrastructure that they need to develop because it's being used by rebel groups. They get into wars. Watch what happened in Somalia. It's been ripped apart by civil wars. Look at what happened in Sudan. It has a TMC that's fighting the Janjaweed militia. What solved these problems? It got solved when Ethiopia came to Sudan, gave them a policy solution that made peace happen because the UAE and Saudi Arabia wanted stability because all of them were making money in that region. So instability happens when you're poor and desperate. And it doesn't mean the dictatorship falls to a revolutionary democratic government. It means it turns into a war zone. Okay, 1 second. What this means then is that not only does Gov have to deal with a bunch of dictatorships falling into disrepair because they don't get loans and weigh that against the few people who get these benefits in the beginning, they also have to deal with all the countries who don't ever get loans at all and then end up destroying themselves. A positive case and a negative case. That should be enough to win this debate. Closing opposition.
I thank the member of opposition for the very fine speech. I now invite the government whip to close their case here.
Shout out to DTU. That's it. Nice people. On that, Vansh, if you want to hear here, you know I'm a more troublesome person than you. So if you want to be irritating, remember I'll be in the next finals as well.
Here. Please don't do it generally because I have difficulty tracking them.
Alright. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. We've won this debate because notice, no other side has a tipping point. Pranjal proves that to you because we give you leverage for these countries to actually enter into these countries when you give them the point of entering, liberalizing them. This means that USA enters, sets up their military, sets up their communities, sets up their companies. China comes and Germany comes, utilizes the raw material, raw resources and institutionalizes them to make benefits. But also notice, Germany has benefits as well. They can enter. All of these big companies can now enter and have some leverage to actually, one, change internal policies towards their benefits and actually liberalize this country, not just for the betterment that O suggests, but actually make it safer. That means we unlock the benefit that O talks about for better creditworthiness, because this means that there is positive, visualization of this country, because you see that, good actors are involved in this country in not just a minimal affair, but also within their policy making, but also with the companies that they themselves have set up here because it's easier. China sets up sweatshops here because it's cheaper labor for them, and we're biting that trade-off because it's better. Because notice, the cases in which these loans were taken were extremely bad. These aren't regular loans that CEO suggests that other countries won't be able to take. This isn't that India is demanding for a loan and then they won't get it because, they might just opt in. Pranjal proves to you that the minimum threshold for these countries to get this wave off is extremely high, and it's also restructuring, because notice the motion says that it should not be enforceable how these loans were initially taken. These loans were exceptionally bad because these were monarchical and autocratic states. These people who gave these loans knew that the chances of return are extremely low. That means, one, the structure of these loans are exceptionally coercive. That means taking away of natural and raw resources that these people already had. That means, one, these countries don't have the capacity of choosing within these loans, and that's why there's a tipping point for these countries to be able to opt into this institution, and it's exceptionally important. One, because OG has no fucking model and Mehal beats their ass, but also we break the model that Mehal gives you. One, because we give optionality to these countries. When you go forward and do this, it goes forward and not coerces, but gives some sort of institutionalization for these countries to actually opt in. What are these countries? Why will they never opt into the IMF? One, IMF is extremely coercive and seen as a negative body, as a Western state. That means the more leverage that you give to these countries, like North Korea, South Sudan, you're helping these countries actually liberalize and get these people to benefit. Without this, these countries never opt out of the current regime that they have. This is a future setup. That means Somalia isn't going to get better right now. But with this institution existing, there might be a push towards it. When North Korea destabilizes in the future, Kim Jong-un falls, the people who are living in desperate poverty opt into this system, and this is their only mechanism to do this, because they don't have to fear USA intruding in and taking away all of their raw material. This is exceptionally important, because notice, CEO is going to whip dump very coercively. Shaurya has no mechanism for proving why exactly do these countries ever get out of this poverty. They just say that, you'll just get up and get more loans. That's debt trap. You don't want to be in a debt trap. And why do these countries even give you these debts, and why do they give you these loans is impossible. Because of O's mech, they see that you don't have credit legitimacy. But when we give you this leverage, I agree, this country is going to be fucked. It's going to be a monopoly for the US and all of these big countries. But it's better than what these countries are right now. Because one, you get some sort of employment within these countries when you have stable structures governing there, and you don't have active violence from militias that exist within these countries. You have countries like Nike and Adidas and sweating up their sweatshops. This is fine because there is a trickle down of money. And even if it's exceptionally low, it's better than what exists right now within the protectionist system that only empowers the monarchical regime that exists right now. Also, when they say that, you'll just go forward and do this in bad ways and other countries won't get it. One, I think our model beats that out. Another extension on OG, which they didn't have. But CEO just says that you won't get these loans because you fear that these won't get forgiven and any body will forgive them. They will understand that the conditionality placed on these people are not things that can be accepted as easily as things that aren't done previously. One, the conditionalities, I'll just repeat them so that you have them on your sheets. This has to be a complete regime change which allows for democratization and liberalization. Why is this exceptionally important? Because notice, the policy changes that happen when a regime shifts are the only ways in which you can institutionalize and actually govern this country in better mannerisms. This can't be applicable to countries that cannot have a regime and extreme shift in their stances. Notice, when you do this, you're able to monopolize and profit off of these countries. Why can you not do that before that? IMF has already been disproven and pushed out of this debate by Pranjal. They need to prove why debt restructuring and all of that is something that IMF is capable of. Exceptionally, why? Because IMF is not capable of doing that right now. IMF will literally get most of the countries that are within it pulling out as well. But because IMF doesn't give them any benefits of this court does, because it gives them the leverage to opt in further and further into these countries. This doesn't destabilize the market interest rates that exist across all countries that IMF is a fucking part of, because 208 countries are a part of IMF. That means you go forward and affect all of these countries when IMF is actually taking this decision. This is a court of justice, and that's why it's easier for this board to actually make this decision than IMF. But also, the profit incentive for these countries is exceptional for the buy-in period, because notice, when you actually start making some sort of profit, it's easier to get those profits off from these countries. But before I continue, yeah.
At best, your case is symmetrical because if both sides have the same sort of people like lending their money, which is to say, on your side the coercion is even greater. On our side,
We are fine. Oh my God, they're saying that I bite my trade off and they don't. I agree that it is coercive. Yes, these countries are going to get fucked, but it's better right now because they're getting nothing on your side with their own mech, which they had to prove. The entire op bench does not have a comparative. They just say that, oh, this will get worse later on. Why? How does it happen? No mech on that. Please read your sheets to explain why exactly does op make these countries better. Because notice, the optionality of buy-in that we give to these countries gives a leverage for these countries to actually enter this state. Without this, it's seen as a rogue nation, without stability, without any opportunity for credit worthiness ever coming about. When do you do this? You're actually making some sort of profit. Why does no country opt in without this? And this is going to be winning material. Before this, the money that you've put into this state is drowned. How was it utilized? Monarchical regimes use it for luxurious purchases and go forward and waste this monies in manner where it's not returnable. This is important because this proves our case that this country does not have the capacity to go forward and pay it. That means, one, these monarchical regimes actually go forward and wasted this money. That means even if you want some sort of return coming out of it, you need to prove leverage that when you invest again, it won't be worsened. We give you that leverage on our side when we tell you that this leverage is only possible when you enter into their policies and do it in your own coercive manners. These coercive mechanisms are the only ways in which this country will, like big countries will enter this smaller country and utilize it for their benefits. But the trickle down is better because poverty-ridden country with no employment is better than a poverty-ridden country with a minimal amount of employment.
I thank the government whip for the very fine speech. I now invite the opposition whip to close their case and this debate. Here.
Cool. Yeah, shout out to DTU still, because at least we make finals. So that's good. Yeah, shout out to Shaurya. Good team ups. I don't know, whack cases. I can't understand half of them, but I'll still try. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I want to push CG out of this debate completely. Their case is that if your debt can get waived off, only then the debtor country, or the creditor country, which is giving you the money, has an incentive to step in and change the system. My problem is, there's an independent incentive for these countries to enter your market in the first place. Why? Because they need the money back. So you don't need to go ahead and give them this leverage. Rather, what you do on CG is you take away, or you give an option that your leverage can be taken away, and that's when you will take away the leverage so they don't have any ability to enter your markets in the first place. Most loans comes with strings attached. Those strings need to be maintained. If you take the loan out, the strings also go away with them. And these countries have incentives. Germany, US, all these countries have incentives to recoup their money. So they'll invest in this country in multiple other ways. They'll open up your markets, they'll set up companies so that you can revitalize the economy and pay them back. So they have independent incentives to fulfill the same problem that CG wants to fulfill. I think they are dead fourth in this debate. Opening government then. 2 pushes from opening government. 1, they say that you need the money right now, and then you have to delegitimize the previous regime because they were bad. I have just 2 responses to this. First, I think that new regime, this is where our case gets unlocked the most, right? Because they assume that as soon as you take away the debt that the previous regime had, immediately you have infinite money glitch and you can start investing wherever you want. Most regimes that come after dictatorial regimes have a propensity to democratic blackslide. That means that they are not stable regimes. When that happens, no one actually wants to give you the debt.
because they know that if you backslide into something else, the regime changes again. So that means that the debt you now take is also forgiving, right? Because the same precedence that you created by the legal system that goes ahead and forgives the debts in the first place. So they have to act on the same precedence that the country was not stable. That's why you took your debt in the first place. But you're again not stable now because your country backslid into autocracy. So you're again not stable. So you repay the debt. You don't repay the debt again. That means you don't get the debt after you go ahead and had the first case passed on OG's best case scenario. That means you don't get debts on their side. This is what CO case is uniquely tells you, right? That at a point in time when most other countries need debts, and this is especially true for like authoritarian regimes or dictatorships that actually want to and sustain themselves. Sure, they are corrupt, but there's some trickle down of money that happens as a consequence of you having a lot of money, right? Okay, you can buy all Audis and Bugattis that you want, but after a point the money has to go down somewhat because you invest back in the system in of itself. That only happens when these dictatorial regimes have the money. If they don't get money because you create a precedence of your money getting or your loans being waived off, you don't give these dictatorial regimes money. When they don't get money, they consolidate power locally. That means they go ahead and screw up the people even more or create internal factions so that they don't have to pay any sort of money much more. So they take more money out of the system as opposed to putting money into the system. So at that point, you probably have lesser money for these developed dictatorships to even go ahead and help the people. I think all teams concede that money for these developing countries or these small countries are important. I don't have to weigh that anymore. But secondly, what's the other likelihood that these dictatorships go for, right? They have interventions from US. They have interventions from big countries that want to go ahead and establish a democracy forcefully. That's why these countries are likely to intervene much more when they don't have these regimes don't have the capacity themselves to go ahead and stand on their own feet because you've rejected the amount of money that they get at all points, right? What is the second claim on opening government? They say that you create mass mobilization and you create more information just by going to public with this, and now China saying, oh, you have good big balls, so we're going to support you. The problem is China already knows that you're debt ridden. They'll anyway going to invest in your country so that they can go ahead and push against the US because they have the proxy incentive to create those systems or create geopolitical take advantage anyway. So I'm not really sure what's the tipping point of this to happen or why you going public is going to suddenly alarm China. They're probably going to do it anyway any further. But again, if this is the best case scenario in opening government, that this creates more information, I'll posit that their framing is wrong because their framing is that you go for this at the last resort. I think if this creates so many positive implications, this is the first thing you opt into as soon as you create a new regime. That means when you opt into this in the first instance, you don't opt for alternatives like restructuring that we tell on our side. So one can't claim N+1 advantage because the one comes before the N as opposed to the other options that we have. So the restructuring of debt and the ability for you to get and liberalize your economy or get the strings attached to change behavioral patterns in a manner that the country sustains itself in the long run don't get unlocked as soon as you go for this first information, which is first chance, which is you going and getting the debt rejected. Before I go on, sure.
If op case is that the regime democratically backslides because it has an incentive to do this, their case in and of itself is a non-starter because just getting more money will not lead to changing these incentives. Cool. There is no comparative on CO.
Got it. No one has incentive to democratically backslide, firstly. That question is wrong. Second, they say that if you don't have capacity, you will never actually grow. The problem is, to get more capacity, you need the previous debt waived off, sure, but you need more money also after that, right? If you don't get the money, how do you build capacity? I'm not sure how by waiving off the debt suddenly makes your system efficient and you create more GDP. You don't do that. You do that uniquely on our side of the house. That you get more money, even if you had accumulated debt. That debt can only be paid off when the systems become efficient, when the economy is revitalized, when businesses grow. So when a new regime comes and you give them a handful of money to use them in a better manner than the previous regime, only then they can go ahead and revitalize the economy to pay off the previous debt. That's exactly how debt restructuring works in the first place. I'm not sure why those alternatives ever unlock on opening government's case. I think they probably are out of this debate anyway, right? Why do we waiver opening opposition? And this is very clean. Opening opposition is exceptionally uncharitable to Gov bench because they say that you will just do irresponsible loan taking and that's something that's bad. We say that even if you take responsible loans, the problem is you should be held accountable for the system you are now creating in the first place, a new regime. But the problem is if you start blaming the previous regime and then your loans get taken away, the incentives of other actors who go and fund IMF or the big countries who give you loans also goes down massively. So you don't get the money to go ahead and revitalize the economy at any point. Second, opening government says that developed countries don't opt in. I think this is a rather irrelevant clash in this debate anyway, right? Probably as everyone's opting in, I really don't see what's the point. But third, we are very clear on our impact of closing the opposition. We clearly tell you that the only certain harm
of you creating this court is that people are now afraid to give you loans. This means the big actors, the MNCs, are afraid to fund IMF's pockets, but also give you direct loans, because now they know the debt can be waived off at any point, right? So they never have the capacity to go ahead and actually to invest in your country, because you know that you're an unstable actor. Most of the odious debt only exists for countries that are like probably have the ability to go and backslide because they're unstable political systems. Those countries will never get the debt on their side because they know this regime can change at any point and the debt will just be vanished. This is OG's best case scenario, and you beat them on the best case scenario. Why do you win this debate? That even in the best case scenario, if you have some country who gets benefit in the short term, the problem is there are a lot of other countries, because you create a legal precedence, right? So a lot of other countries who don't get the debt. These other countries are more important because just scale. They're more in number, but also they are literally more vulnerable because they have a dictator who doesn't have money, is resorting to like interventionist principles, or is going to consult power locally, creating more issues within the economy. And that's the biggest problem. That's a certain harm. All those reasons. Except you have to take this one.
I thank the opposition whip for their very fine speech. I now congratulate everyone for what was a good debate.